Welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog LED with Kevin and Noah. In this podcast series, we will cover all things related to indoor cannabis cultivation. Hello and welcome back to another version of the Cultivation Cast. We are here again with Noah and Kevin. I'm Noah. We got Kevin Friender here along with me.
Hello.
We're here to talk more about growing. And, what we did is we said, what is one of the most common questions we get? And hands down, we agree it's, as a lighting company, the most common question we get is, how do I size a light appropriately for my space? Or what light do I put in this 4x4? Or how many lights do I need in this 20,000 square foot facility? Whether it's a home grow or commercial grow, it is the most common question we get. And of course, being a lighting company, it is a question that growers should be asking us. But we thought we'd talk a little bit about how do you figure that out? There's a lot of different ways to look at it, a lot of different ways to skin that cat. And we're going to go into some of those things and talk about some of the different numbers and metrics you can look at, some that are useful, some that are less useful. And then also talk a little bit about how things like your growing style and the actual space you're in can affect it, because every space is a little different. Any gardener who's gardened indoors for a while can tell you don't ever build an indoor garden and have it work right out of the gate. It always takes a little bit to dial it in. Let's dive into this topic. So, Kevin, when we get these questions a lot about the size, I'm going to take the most common one that we get in like a help desk ticket, because it's not commercial, is I've got a 4x4 tent. What light do I put in there? How would you answer that question?
And unfortunately, there's a number of different ways to answer that question. So the right answer is it depends on what you want to do and what style you're planning on growing with and what kind of yield you want out of that. So, for example, in a 4x4 space, we actually have 4 different sizes of light that will work in a 4x4 space. Actually 5 if you, depending on what you want to do. So, for example, if you're using your 4x4 foot space for vegetative growth, then our 200 watt light will actually work for you in that space and will work pretty well for just vegetatively growing cannabis plants. If you want to actually flower, the 200 watt is not going to be quite enough to cover a 4x4 area. It's not that it won't flower, but the results that you get out of there would be of a lower quality than what we consider acceptable.
And let's back up there. We do have recommendations on our site for every single light, both for the whole family of Phytomax 2 as well as on each individual product page. And please keep in mind that they are recommendations. There is no rule for anything we're telling you about it. It's different. If you're not growing cannabis, you're growing a different type of plant. That's going to change dramatically. Light levels change across plants and even across different cannabis plants. So please keep in mind everything we're telling you is a rule of thumb. And as Kevin said, while the 200, we will tell you it's only really good for veg. But if you stuck it in there with cannabis plants and put it on the proper light cycle, it will flower. But we're not going to tell you to use that light in there because we don't feel it flowers it acceptably to an acceptable level. It won't get you flowers all the way out to the corners. If we're going to tell you a light is going to work in a 4x4, we believe it needs to actually grow flowers all the way out to the edges of that.
Well, and there's a difference between growing flowers and growing flowers you'd actually want to harvest. I mean, the 200 may work in the corners to actually grow some larvae, little tiny buds in the corner, but that's not considered acceptable by us. So that's why we don't recommend the 200 for a 4x4 foot area and feel that you really need at least the 400 watt light for the 4x4 foot area.
And then, as you were saying, we can go up from there, right? The 400 is your starting point for a 4x4.
And yes, so that's where it really depends on what methodology you're planning on using, and to some extent what strain you're planning on using, and how much yield you're looking for. So, for example, if you're planning on growing sea of green, shorter plants that never get really particularly tall, then you don't need high light intensity, good penetration through the canopy, and you don't need our 1,000 watt light to get a good sea of green out of a 4x4 foot area. Our 400 watt light will work great for a 4x4 foot area and will yield you with good yielding strains. It should get you at least a pound per harvest out of a 4x4 foot area. However, by increasing the light intensity, moving up to the next size light with our 600 watt light, you can actually get at least a pound and a half per harvest out of the 4x4 foot foot area, and you can start to grow your plants a little bit taller. So if you were planning on vegging for a few weeks before flipping into flower, the 600 might be an appropriate size for a 4x4 foot area. And then if you were planning on vegging a little bit longer still, so maybe 4 or 5 weeks to get even larger plants, the 800 watt, the Phytomax 2 800 would be great for a 4x4 foot area, and you should get at least 2 pounds out of that area. And then if you want to maximize your results out of the 4x4, we'd recommend our Phytomax 2 1000. Again, it's going to be overkill if you're doing a sea of green, but if you're growing taller plants and a thicker canopy, that's where you need more light intensity to get better penetration. And with the 1000, you should be getting at least 2.5 pounds per harvest out of the 4x4 foot area. So with all of these things, it depends on the methodology you're planning on growing with, how large the plants are going to be that you're planning on flowering. But it also depends a little bit on what yield you're looking for, as well as what your area can actually handle, because our 400 watt light puts off twice as much heat as our 200 watt light does, and our 800 watt light puts off twice as much heat as our 400 watt light does. So if you're in a particularly warm area, or you're having difficulty keeping the temperatures down, then going with our largest light may not be the right choice for you. So there's a lot of moving variables that you have to look at when determining what the light level that you want is. And it also depends on exactly the different size. So we just went over a complete example with a 4x4 foot area. But if you have a different size area, it starts getting a little bit trickier, especially if you go with a non-standard size area. For example, a 3x4 foot area, figuring out what light you need in there starts to become a little bit trickier. And that's where it's actually useful to look at measurements, metrics of exactly how intense the light is.
So let's go into the other spaces in a moment. The 4x4 is a great place to start because that is kind of an industry standard. Even when you work in large commercial grows, they often break things down into 4x4 areas so it's easier to understand and really look at the space. So as Kevin said, they're definitely smaller. You know, we sell 2x2 tents all the way up to larger than 4x4, but 4x4 is the standard. So getting back to it, one of the things that I'll often ask a customer when they call and ask about a 4x4 is say, look, what do you want to get out of it? Because that's one of the most important things, because as Kevin said, you're going to get yield out of it with our 400, our 600, our 800, or 1000. They're going to cost more to buy as you go up to the bigger lights, more cooling. You'll have larger yields though. So if a lot of people, a good place to start is to say, how much do I really want to have out of here? How much weight do I need to pull? And then I'll buy the appropriate light for that. And then some people ask, yes, intuitively you think, well, wouldn't I get different weights out of a 3x3 or a 4x4? Yes, to some degree you can get more out of a 4x4, but the light's going to dictate a lot of that. You will hit a point of diminishing returns. You can't put 2,000 watts in a 4x4 and get double what you got with a 1,000 watt light. That's just not the way it works. But as you scale up from the 400 to the 1,000, in a 4x4, which will all work and will work inside of that space, you're going to scale up your yields. So a good place to start is that. And once you've kind of determined, okay, I know my range of yield I want, and you've got to keep in mind if you're a home grower, you're going to harvest, let's say, on average about every 3 months, let's say. So how much cannabis or CBD or hemp do you need every 3 months? And then that's got to last you till the next harvest. So you can kind of figure it out that way. And then you can step back and look at things like price, cost of the light to purchase, because again, they get more expensive the larger light you're buying. And also, as Kevin said, other considerations like your environment, such as do I want this large amount of heat with 1,000 versus a 400, which is a lot less heat. So those are all things to look at, but yield is a really good place to start. Now, if you have a small tent, let's say we go all the way down to our smallest, which is 2.5 by 2.5, or we used to sell even a 2x2. And a 2x2, the only light we recommended was the 200. Anything more than that got a little crazy. Now our 2.5 by 2.5 tent, we can support a 400 in there. And as Kevin said, you're getting into higher light levels, and you can definitely pull more weight out of the 2.5 by 2.5 with the 400. So there's wiggle room in all of those, and you can kind of play based on what your needs are. But let's say you have an odd, let's go to the harder one now, but we're going to still stay small. We'll get into the larger spaces of warehouses and that in a moment and how to size there. But let's move up to an odd shaped space. Now we sell an odd shaped space, the 2x4. That's a common tent size. There's other larger spaces, there's 3x6s, and then some people build spaces or have a closet or a cabinet they want to use that's odd shape. So now how do we deal with that? And there are really two solutions. It's either using multiple lights, or you can use a light mover. The third option is use a light that's a little too big for the one dimension and raise it up and just understand you're not being as efficient as possible. But with LEDs, we want to be efficient. So one of the ways we look to be as efficient as possible in an odd-shaped space is we want to break it into squares. So in a 2x4, we don't look at it as a 2x4. We look at it really as two 2x2s right next to each other. So in that case, we're moving back to the 2x2, and now we're looking at it, great, it's really a 200. So in a 2x4, your best option is going to be two 200s. The other option is a larger light. You could use double the light, so you only have one light, and you can use a light mover, which we sell as well. And Kevin can explain a little bit about what we're talking about with a light mover, why you use them, why you wouldn't, and where they're appropriate to use.
Yeah, so light movers are a common issue. People don't understand exactly what light movers are meant to do. So for those that aren't familiar with light movers, they are literally devices which physically move a light back and forth. Used to be that there were some light movers on the market that would actually spin lights around in a circle. As far as I know, those have all gone bankrupt due to dropping too many lights on too many gardens, because the spinning only works for so long before it wears itself out, and then the whole thing falls down. But the ones that are set on rails that move back and forth, we sell the Light Rail brand, work remarkably well for physically moving a light back and forth. And in a small area, that can get you a lot of advantages. A lot of people will think, though, that you can put a light on a light mover and magically have it cover twice the area. And it's true, you can have it cover twice the area, but it's going to cover that area with half of the light intensity that way. So a light mover is not a device that will magically make the light cover a bigger area than it was designed to cover. But what it does do is allow you to cover a different shape area with the same light, still the same area in terms of square footage, but a different shape. Instead of square, you can make it rectangular. The other advantage is you can actually place the light closer to the plants. So if you have a situation where you have extremely limited height, a light mover can actually help you reduce the vertical clearance required between your light and your plants to get the light closer to your plants. Doesn't really make sense to use light movers large scale on a commercial basis, I don't think, because they're a moving part, and it does take a lot of extra setup to get them working. In a very small area, they work great. I personally use them in my own basement plant room and move 6 lights back and forth every couple of minutes, and it works great, and has been working great for decades now. But on a massive scale, it may not make sense. But the light movers can't really change how much area the light will effectively cover. All they change is the shape of the area that the light will effectively cover.
Yeah, so the key takeaway there that we always try and reinforce one more time is light movers do not magically multiply the light that your fixture is going to put out. So what they do is stretch your footprint or change the shape of it. They don't add light magically. So light movers are a great tool, and we've brought them to bear. If you came into our office, you'd see them in our tropical plant room, actually moving lights back and forth right here in Black Dog LED office. So come by anytime to check those out. So now we've covered a little bit about that. Let's talk about some of the larger spaces we've covered, like 4x4s, 2x2 smaller, and some of the considerations there. Let's move up into how does this change when you start to look at a commercial facility, a warehouse, or a larger facility, and what are the considerations there? You're dealing with a lot more heat. So now you just have big HVAC. There's no question about you're going to need HVAC. You're going to have dedicated HVAC systems to cool your room. So now what they're generally interested in, they're not worried about a little heat in their basement. They're interested in maximizing their profit and their revenue for the facility. So when we're talking to a commercial grow, it's a little bit more about really how do we get the most profit out of that square footage possible with the least amount of input, of course, and keeping expenses low.
Well, and that's where it comes back to the general rules of thumb, because whether you're dealing with a massive commercial facility or a small, oddly shaped space, for example, a 4x3 foot area, what it really comes down to is going to be your actual light intensity level that the lights are delivering. So we've got a handy calculator on our website that allows you to figure out exactly what the light intensity level would be in terms of photosynthetic active radiation, or PAR, also known as PPFD, photosynthetic photon flux density. And realistically, what we've found is that a range of about 200 PPFD average across the entire area that you're covering is appropriate for good vegetative growth. That's the minimum we recommend for good vegetative growth for cannabis plants, but it's not quite enough to get good flowering out of cannabis plants. The minimum PAR or PPFD level that we recommend to get good growth out of short cannabis plants, such as a sea of green, would be 300 PPFD. That's where we start to see good results and not larvae buds off on the sides. Then as you go up from there, you are just going to increase your light intensity level. So for example, 600 PPFD gets you really good results, really strong flowering for taller plants. And as you start getting above 600 PPFD, you start hitting the law of diminishing returns. So for example, if you move from 300 PPFD to 600 PPFD, you're probably going to double your yield, because the rate of increasing results there is pretty much linear. So you're doubling the light intensity, you're going to double your yield. Once you start getting above 600 ppfd, you start encountering diminishing returns unless you start supplementing CO2. So moving from 600 ppfd to 900 ppfd is not going to necessarily get you 50% higher yield unless you also start supplementing CO2. That doesn't mean you're not going to get a higher yield at 900 ppfd than you would at 600 ppfd if you're not supplementing CO2, but you're not going to get 50% more. It might be closer to 30% more yield because the plants are starting to get starved for carbon dioxide at that point. 900 ppfd on average is where we start seeing cannabis plants showing signs of too much light stress, if we're not supplementing CO2. So between 900 and 1,000 ppfd, depending on the strains you're growing, is what we recommend as the maximum light intensity level if you're not supplementing CO2. Now, if you are supplementing CO2, you can go even above that. Up to 1,200 ppfd works pretty well when you're supplementing carbon dioxide at a similar approximately 1,200 parts per million on the CO2. You can go up to 1,200 ppfd with your lights and still get increased yields. As you keep pushing plants harder and harder, though, it becomes a little bit trickier to maintain your grow because you're pushing everything to the limit, and things go off the rails a little bit faster if you're going down the rails a little bit faster. So it does make running your grow a little bit trickier. Now, above 1,200 ppfd, we actually have some clients, and we've run grows ourselves, where we've run 1,500, even 1,600 ppfd. And that, even with carbon dioxide, you start getting the law of diminishing returns again. So moving from 1,200 ppfd to 1,500 ppfd, you're not going to see the equivalent percentage in yield increase. But again, you're still going to see an increase as long as you're supplementing CO2. But if you're running above 1,200 ppfd and your CO2 supplementation quits, the plants can actually start showing signs of light stress, too much light, rather quickly. So it's an unsafe level of light if you're not very confident in your system's ability to supplement carbon dioxide.
Yeah, when we did run that test with a very high ppfd, Kevin was talking about the extreme. Basically, we took the test as far as we could until we damaged the plants just to see what plants could take. And we did prove to ourselves what we suspected, which is it is genetic dependent to a degree. You know, we had 3 different strains we were testing at that point with those light levels. And while 2 of them did not handle it in that they did show damage, they didn't die or didn't lose the crops or anything like that. It was more just that they showed light stress on the upper leaves and some of the bud tips and things like that. But what was clearly light damage, light saturation damage. But one of the strains took it like a champ, and it was able to actually outproduce everything else because it was able to use that extra energy, I'd call it almost excessive energy, and actually turn it into flower. Whereas the other two couldn't cope with that much, no matter how much CO2 we gave them, no matter how much good food we fed them, they just couldn't keep up with that much light. So keeping in mind with a lot of these discussions as we're walking through this, the genetics do play a big part. We're all talking about cannabis here, but there's a big difference, and we've seen that whether it's nutrients, lighting levels, temperature, they're all different, but we have definitely, as lighting people, we've played with it and proven to ourselves beyond the shadow of a doubt that genetics do come into play in terms of lighting. We've heard a lot of rumors also about things like Girl Scout cookies being a real low light plant and preferring to have low light, especially latent flower. So there are things like that to take into consideration as well. But going back into the big commercial grows, thinking a little bit about that, as Kevin said, it's really the light levels. So whereas somebody comes in and says, I have a 4x4, I don't ask them about light levels at first. I say, great, what do you want to yield, as I said, when talking to a customer. But if I am talking to a commercial grow, whether I'm talking to the grower or the operations manager, I'm not going to ask, what do you want to get at first? The first thing I'm going to ask is, do you know what light levels you want to hit? And I'm asking about the light levels Kevin just explained. I'm curious, do they know we want to have 900 ppfd across the entire canopy? I want to have 800. I want to have 1200. Most of them still at this point don't have an answer to that, and that's fine. It's a good place just to gauge what the level of knowledge is and understand if they do know what they want. But then immediately, if they don't, I can simply say, great, if you've grown before, let's find a point of reference that we all can understand. So if I'm talking to someone, and they've grown with a single-ended HPS before, and I say, great, you've run that over a 4x4. Were you happy with it? Did you like the results? Maybe the quality wasn't as good as you want, but were you happy with the yield? We know our spectrum is going to get you better quality. The yield is going to depend upon how much light we put over that space. So if they say, yeah, I was growing with a single-ended HPS over a 4x4, then we can simply say, great, we can tell you the equivalent of that is roughly our 600 watt LED, our Phytomax 600, which is actually 630 watts. So if we look at that, we can say that is a good starting point. Now we're speaking the same language. You're talking about that, I'm talking about this, but we're really speaking about the same light levels, which is all that matters for this discussion. Now we can go up from there and say, great, now if we wanted to add more light, we can go to 800 or 1,000 over that 4x4, and we're going to give you more light and more yield to go along with that. The other thing is they could come back and say a double-ended HPS, and that's a different light level. Or they might grow a CMH. We understand that. But those light levels are all fairly consistent across different fixtures, different bulbs, different ballasts. They're all fairly pretty much the same, similar enough to where we know what they're talking about in terms of light levels. Of course, if the grower knows, hey, I've been growing under these light levels, and this works for me, if they can tell us what that is, that helps us then go to the drawing board, go to the software, and simulate a room for them that matches the lighting levels they want, which should give them the production they want and increase their quality. Now, again, if they were running single-ended or even double-ended, we can give higher lighting levels by putting more lights or closer together and increase their yield and their quality if that's what they're looking to do. So that's taking that PPFD, and we're taking that and saying, so now we use that to help design the room. And our goal is to give them an average blanket of light across the entire space. And we've touched on this in previous conversations, but it's worth talking about again. Sticking lights in a room can give you light levels, but how efficiently you're using those fixtures depends on how you set up that room. Now, in a grow tent or in a closet or something in someone's house, we have walls on all sides. We have what we call light containment. Now, the goal there is to make that as reflective as possible. And we're going to tell you something that's going to blow your mind, because it blew mine. Silver is not reflective. It is to our eyes, but it's not what we want to use in a grow room. What we wanted to do is diffuse and reflect as much broad range of the spectrum as possible back to the plants and diffuse in a nice, even way. The best for that is actually flat white paint. Yes, you can also use Panda Tarp, and one of the best things in the world that we love using, that's Orca Film. It's a grow film that is highly reflective and does a great job of diffusing light and is awesome. And it's
also very sturdy.
Yeah, and it's a vapor barrier as well.
It blocks infrared light. It is very moisture resistant. It's extremely cleanable. I've had it hanging in my basement getting abused, not just slightly abused, but very much abused with extreme humidity levels that grow algae on the walls. And I can just scrub it down and get it clean, and it's been working great for years.
That's amazing. It is great stuff. So that's your best option. Second best is going to be a flat white paint. Of course, you want to use something durable that's going to stand up to the humidity or the pounding of your grower and whatever it's going to take in there. So that's great for a small space, a tent, a tent or a grow room. We want white if possible. Silver is fine in all these tents that everybody sells out there. It's not ideal, but it's certainly better than a black interior or something else that's even less reflective. So our goal is to get as much light bounce back as possible onto the plants in a contained growing space. So even in a commercial grow, we want benches next to walls. We don't want them floating in the middle of the room. But more importantly is how you space benches and how you hang lights in a commercial facility itself. In the olden days, everyone had fixed aisles where you had a bench and then you had a 3 or 4 foot aisle, then another bench, then another 3 or 4 foot aisle. So all the light that missed those plants and fell off the benches was going onto the ground and wasn't being used by anything. And there was a lot of wasted space. And as Kevin will say, it's the kind of the edge of bench ratio to the overall space. It's just, you have too much edge, if that makes sense. Now, when you're having brownies, that's good. Everybody wants the edge of the brownies. They make those special pans to get all the edges you can. But in grow rooms, we want no edges. We actually want light next to light, no edges, because as any grower knows, the weakest harvest is going to come from the edge of their grow. That's just the way the physics are going to work with the light. If I have 20 lights in a big square, the center will be great, but as soon as I get to the edge of that, I'm going to end up with having edges that are going to be weaker and weaker around the perimeter of that grow. So the goal is to compact them as much as possible in a light the room approach. And Kevin can explain a little bit about why we do a light the room approach and really what that means to us. And that's the way people are going. It's the more efficient way to set up your lights in a larger grow.
Yeah, and that's where we just place lights spaced evenly. For the most part, usually it's evenly spaced over the entire area. And then rather than using fixed benches or fixed areas where you're growing your plants in fixed aisleways, put everything on carts or casters so that it can be moved back and forth, and you can create an aisleway to access your plants on demand. A lot of people, when they're first growing, especially as they first start scaling up, will think that, I can just put a whole bunch of plants in an area and I'll just move a few to get off to the side to get to that back one in the back corner. Well, I can tell you from personal experience, no matter how good your intentions are, that plant in the back corner is going to get neglected if you have to move other plants to get to it. Even if you really, really mean to take very extra good care of it, because it's harder to get to than the plants in the front, it will never receive as much attention. And that's where you start ending up with insect breakouts that you don't notice until they're really too far down the road, or you end up with that plant getting skipped a little bit on watering, you're getting overwatered, and because it's not easily accessible and noticeable right up front, it's going to be a problem. So a lot of people are tempted to just put a whole bunch of plants in a big area and see that they'll be able to move them and get to them. But realistically, what you need to do is have some way that you can very easily make yourself an aisleway to get and access all of your plants. I think in an ideal world, none of your plants would be more than 3 feet from an aisleway, because that's about how far back the average person can reach to actually access plants and do a good job of maintaining them and taking care of them. So by putting everything on tables with casters on it or rollers on it, some way that you can actually just move your tables back and forth, create aisleways on demand, you can get the best of both worlds. You can cram a whole bunch of plants in there, reduce your total wasted space that's wasted on aisleways to a very minimal amount, and then you can create that aisleway on demand very easily by just rolling something out of the way so that you can easily access all of your plants and give them all the care that they deserve.
And keep in mind that some people think about this as, well, I got to get in there and work. It's like, well, you understand that most of the time the plants are in there doing their own thing all by themselves. You're really not in there all that much. Even if you're hand watering, you're only in there every 2 days, and you're only in there for a finite amount of time during those 2 days. So it's really not something to be concerned about getting to them. You do want it to be easy to move these benches. I like systems that I see that are set up where one person can move them. If you have a long run that's not easy to move, it might take 2 people to separate the benches, which isn't terrible, but it does change your labor requirements in your facility. So for those of you that are home growers listening to this, though, you'll understand that having your grow area, your grow bench movable is huge. If you like to be able to circle it, great. Have it on wheels so you can get away, but put it against the wall when you're going to just let it grow in between when you're tending to it, because the numbers show that you're going to get 10-15% at least by sticking it next to the wall, getting that reflection versus floating in the middle of a room. That's 10 to 15% more yield, and that's free. all you have to do is stick it against the wall. You're not adding more energy to your grow. You're not needing more cooling. You don't need to buy any equipment. You just need to put it next to a wall. So if you can do that, use reflective surfaces to retain the light and reflect it back in. It's also a good way to get some more light to the undercarriage, because a lot of times it'll bounce down and get to the lower parts as well. So very good to maximize the use of your lights. Again, we know the light levels we want to hit, but we still want to use those lights as efficiently as possible. So even though they're LEDs and they're more efficient than you're going to get with other types of lighting technologies, it is still something we want to maximize as much as possible. So setting it up, as Kevin said, where you're not wasting space is the greatest way to do it. Also, in terms of build out for your facility, you're paying to build out square footage, you're paying to maintain that square footage, you're paying taxes on it, everything. You need to maximize production to stay competitive. So getting as much into each room and getting the most yield out of those rooms is critical. So we've covered all of the major considerations and a lot of the things we think about on a minor level as well when you're looking at a grow and sizing lights. And as Kevin mentioned, we do have a calculator on our site, and it doesn't just offer help in sizing it. It offers things like PAR, PPFD levels, DLI, PBAR, which is planned biological active radiation, which is another offshoot of PAR. And the hanging height is critical. We've talked a lot about finding the right size light for your space, but hanging it for the footprint you're trying to obtain is critical with LEDs, even more so I've found than back in the days of HPS and growing with those. So we have a calculator on our site that calculates that for you based on the light and the size of the space you're trying to cover. Every one of our product pages does have some information regarding hanging heights for standard sizes like a 4x4, but if you're curious about more details and you want to see a hanging height for unique space, just go ahead and visit the calculator on our site, and you're going to find that at blackdogled.com/calculator. Again, that's blackdogled.com/calculator. You'll find multiple calculators there, and please enjoy using that. And thank you again for joining us on a Cultivation cast. We look forward to having you around for future casts as well. And I'd like to remind you to keep an eye on our social media. We're coming down to the wire with a Massachusetts test grow. And that is where we're using limited wattage that's required for commercial grows in Massachusetts under the licensing laws. We're using the wattage required for commercial grows in Massachusetts that basically has to do with how much wattage they can have per square foot over any commercial grow average throughout the facility. So if you're curious what you can do with low wattage, check our social media. We'll be taking that down in about a week, and we'll be posting all the results for everyone to see, and we'll do a full case study on that as well. Happy gardening, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.